Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. I am Tamara Johnson Shealey. Good morning. Can you believe it? We're already into the month of March. Today is Saturday, March the 6th. This is our Saturday broadcast. I don't know where my trusty co-hosts are this morning, but our guest is here. It's going to be a rich conversation. It's a lot of things that I don't know, and I'm still learning. And I was listening to Sirius XM one maybe Friday or Saturday afternoon and heard this gentleman talking about Cuba and just talking about a whole lot of things. And I just stopped. I was on my way into the grocery store and I stopped and I sat in the car and listened to his entire interview. And I was like, I don't know who this man is, but I am going to find him and I am going to reach out to this gentleman. So we have him on the broadcast today. Let me bring him in. Good morning, Mr. Obi.
Good morning, Sister Tamara. How are you?
I am wonderful. Thank you for joining us this morning.
I'm honored to be on.
Thank you. So you know my story and how I found you.
Yes.
I was in the car and I said, I don't know who he is, but I am going to look him up. I wrote your name down and I looked you up on social media and I wanted to have a further conversation with you. So thank you for joining me. And I'm going to let you introduce yourself because you have your bio is rich. So I'll let you start.
Okay, sure. My name is Obi Egbunda Jr. I am a journalist. I'm the U.S. correspondent to the Herald, which is the national newspaper in Zimbabwe. I'm a children's playwright. I'm the co-founder of the Mass Emphasis Children's History and Theater Company, and I've written 25 children's plays. And I'm an African history teacher, and I've been teaching African children our history for the last 31 years. And I'm an organizer. So I'm a product of the 90s generation. I'm turned 51 years old in October. But I come to you today in a capacity. I'm the external relations officer of the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association. Yeah. So in a nutshell, that's just a little bit of a profile for this conversation this morning.
Yeah. I'm delighted to have you. Good morning, Miss Robbie.
Good morning. I'm excited to hear our special guest.
I'd say telling everybody I found him on Sirius XM and he was talking about, he was talking about Cuba and I know very little about the complicated relationship that America has with Cuba. And, you being a Latino woman, Robbie, you probably know a lot more than, most of us. But I wanted to bring Mr. Obi on because I wanted us to start with a history lesson. I think Georgians, you're an activist. You're out here, Mr. Obi. So let's just dive in.
Okay. I think that in the context of U.S. history, I want to begin with something that I always deal with when I deal with my students, and I teach everything from K through 12. So one of the things in the spirit of fundamental change that we have to do, because change starts with conception, of course, and of course we try to develop a harmonious blend between theory and practice. But just for the sake of clarity, we challenge ourselves to look carefully and objectively and scientifically at the definition of America that the Democrats and Republicans use. Anybody who does that will come away with the conclusion that it's a fascist overture in the tradition of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. First of all, they cannot proclaim to be America. That's geographically incorrect. So we're talking about North America, South America, Central America, Latin America, the Caribbean, the entire Western Hemisphere. So Cuba is part of America in that context. And also, based on the tradition of colonialism, based on the tradition of captivity, based on the tradition of rape and plunder, it is very important not to begin the relationship in 1959 when the Cuban Revolution made their historic triumph on January 1st, 1959. You have to go back to U.S. history. The first 7 presidents of the United States of America attempted to annex Cuba. So if they had their way, Cuba would have been like Texas and California, which authentically are parts of Mexico, as we know, that were snatched away. Or it would be an extended territory like Puerto Rico is as they fight for their sovereignty, like Guam or the Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, as it is called. So the first 7 presidents of the United States, that was a foreign policy top priority agenda item to annex Cuba. So we would be calling Cuba like we call Alabama or Florida or Tennessee or Wisconsin or any of the other 50 states. That's number one. Number two, the Spanish American War, which lasted from 1868 to 1890, was Spain, the Spanish colonialists, and the U.S. colonialists fighting over who would control Cuba. So before we get, and also, one of the things we know because of the amputated narrative of the African experience, we only take a look at the captivity of our ancestors um, from Virginia to Maryland to the Carolinas to Georgia to Tennessee, the traditional landscape. But we must not forget that our ancestors were dropped off in Cuba, where we can say that the ships of captivity have the distinction of being the first form of public transportation. We were dropped off everywhere, the same way the bus or the subway drops you off. So in Cuba, we had 300 uprisings. So before Nat Turner's uprising, before Gabriel Denmark Vesey's uprising, before many of the other uprisings, but they were 300 in Cuba, and the most decorated one was from a man named Jose Aponte, who was beheaded and his head was put in a cage as a form of terrorist intimidation. In the context of our struggle to have political parties that are self-determining and focused, self-determining in intent, in 1908, the first all-African political party was established in Cuba called Partido Independiente de Color, which stands for the Independent Party of Color. So that's 1 year before you had the NAACP. That's 1 year before Catherine Dunham, the great dancer, was born. That's 1 year before Osaje for Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, as today is Ghanaian Independence Day. They gained their independence on March 6, 1957. So happy Independence Day to our people in Ghana. But in 1909, the same year Dr. Du Bois wrote the book about John Brown, the abolitionist, and called for an Encyclopedia Africana. The year before that, our people in Cuba already understood how important it was to have our own political party. So before we talk about Cuba during Fidel Castro's tenure as leadership, you have to go back to a stain in United States history so you can understand that the policy, the root of the hostility, the root of the white supremacist disposition, the root of the hatred, the root of the anger towards Cuba.
Robbie, you want to jump in? You're native Puerto Rican. You're from your family's Puerto Rican.
Well, the gentleman's right, and I'm so grateful to have this dialogue because it shows a lot of parallels, between struggles. And I think that's something that gets complicated, especially in discussions of reparations and ADOS, because we have such a huge immigration situation right now, and there seems to be almost a lack of unity or division, which is understandable. But if you look at it in the context that the professor just explained, there's a reason, the imperialism, the history, the global economy, why people are coming here, and how the countries, specifically what he stated, South, Latin, the Caribbean, got into the states that they are. So I'm hoping, I just saw the movie last night, Jesus and the Black Messiah, and it was, although it was, very emotional, I was grateful that it showcased the alliances that people who have similar struggles can come together. The Black Panthers were meeting with the Young Lords and meeting with people of lower income who were even white. And when you understand it from the context of history and the background, and I think that makes a huge difference. And I can't stand it when people say it's today. I don't want to revisit. I want to talk about now. You can't talk about now without understanding the background. It's an incomplete picture. And so I agree with you. And I'm so happy that, to continue to listen.
Yes, and I'm glad that you brought that up because once again, using something that is of paramount importance in terms of the historical landscape and our struggle inside United States borders and how it's connected to these other things. This is something else in relationship to Cuba prior to the revolution. The Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who was a young man, read Up from Slavery from Booker T. Washington, his autobiography, and that's what inspired him to come to the United States and start the largest mass movement we've had even till this day. And even though it was started in Harlem, the largest branch ended up being in Louisiana. Once again, understanding the importance of the South for us as African people. The Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey in the UNIA had 40 branches in Cuba, 40 of them. So, and the reason why the UNIA was dangerous, and long before J. Edgar Hoover came out with his theory and outlook on what people call the Black Messiah, his coming of age was the dismantling of the UNIA and the deportation of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey. So the fact that we had 40 branches of the UNIA in Cuba and had it all over the Caribbean and all over the Americas, that is another point of reference for us when we talk about African and Cuban relations. So that's very important to mention. In relationship to immigration, you brought that up, so I feel obligated to bring this up as well. One of the things that transcends both parties in the context of immigration, you have to look at U.S. foreign policy. The reason being is because if you do that, there are certain nations on this planet that their citizens who aspire to come here, they're not subjected to the bureaucracy. If I come here from Venezuela and I say, I want to join you in your efforts to bring about regime change because we want Nicolas Maduro removed from power, you will not be subjected to the bureaucracy synonymous with immigration. If you come here from Cuba and say you want to help in the tradition of the Cuban American National Foundation, which Ronald Reagan administration bankrolled in '83, which was responsible for 90% of the 635 assassination attempts on the life of Comandante Fidel Castro, and you come in saying you're against that revolution, you have the green light to come into the United States and go right to Miami and work with organizations like um, Brothers to the Rescue and Alpha 66 terrorist organizations. If you come here from Eritrea and you say that you're against the government of Afwerki and you want to work for regime change in Eritrea, you are not subjected to the bureaucracy. If you come here from Zimbabwe and you say, Emerson Mnangagwa is worse than Robert Mugabe was, I want to join the Democrats and Republicans in bringing about regime change in Zimbabwe, you will be allowed to come into this country. So one of the things, unfortunately, that is not addressed enough when we talk about immigration
We're
is
picking
how.
up. Stop 1 second. We're picking up. Yeah, you must have a little one.
Yeah, yeah. I'm
We're
gonna
picking
go
up.
to another room,
Okay, you want us
but
to? You want us to take your camera off, and Robbie and I will come back.
yeah, real quickly.
Okay, let's let him regroup. I remember when my kids were small, and I swear you couldn't do nothing. This is history, Robbie, and this is a lot of history that a lot of us. I'm not familiar with the Cuban story, the history of Cuba. So, I was so delighted that he would be a guest on our broadcast.
He's going to be perfect because a lot of people couldn't understand, or they didn't understand what happened in Florida with the Cubans in the election. And I think this will give context. What he just described, and who's allowed to come here is really about strategy and resources. Venezuela is oil rich. And so if you're willing to side with the elites, you're let into this country quicker. Puerto Rico is such a completely different scenario. We're more like Hawaii, where everything was pretty much utilized as a resource, and the people were pretty much what he said, colonized, but there was no investment in people. So even if Puerto Rico were to be completely liberated today, which really people wouldn't, I don't know that would happen in how people would organize, because people are so indoctrinated, which I know you speak a lot about in terms of African Americans and being indoctrinated in how, the viewpoint of even the church at times and the stronghold that the church has.
Come back.
PR is, hey.
Okay. There. Yes. And interestingly enough, like you mentioned, Puerto Rico, one of our heroes, the great Arturo Schomburg, when he started the Schomburg Center for African History and Culture, when he first showed up in New York City in Harlem in the late 1800s, right before the 20th century, the first organization he joined was the Revolutionary Committee for Puerto Rico. And the objective of that organization was to fight for the independence of Puerto Rico and the independence of Cuba. So 60 years before Comandante Malcolm, Fidel Castro and Malcolm X met in the Hotel Teresa in 1960, Harlem was already a hotbed for solidarity with our people in Cuba and our people in Puerto Rico. So the ties go back very far, and the work that we're doing right now, the objective is just to maintain that tradition, those solidarity, and expand on it.
And it really depends on how you grew up. Like I grew up in New York City in the Bronx, so I was
Hmm.
always around, you know,
Right.
I mean, so it always. And if you look at the similarities with the food and the dance and religion, even,
Hmm.
it's the similarities are unquestionable. There's just parallels continuous. So today it's almost saddening to see, you know, the lack of understanding on where people are reacting with what happened in Florida and the election and the Cubans there. I don't know if you can expound a bit on that to help
Well, yeah,
people.
yes, I can. First of all, you have to go back to the Kennedy administration and the role of Florida, because you have a 1961 attempted invasion of Cuba called the Bay of Pigs invasion, initiated by the CIA, which failed. And after it failed, the objective then became to impose the blockade on Cuba, which still exists today, which was imposed in 1962. So for people who look at life itself through the lens of the Democratic Party and the lens of the Republican Party, or the lens of the lovers' quarrel, the never ending lovers' quarrel between Democrats and Republicans, that's very important to put in context for them. So when you look at it from that vantage point, you realize that both of them want regime change in Cuba. So what ended up happening after that is, once the blockade was imposed, it's just been something that they've had to deal with. It has cost them nearly $200 billion since 1962. But in spite of that, they have the highest literacy rate in the world. They have the lowest infant mortality rate in the world. They are the face of the fight to eradicate corona on this planet. They they are revered in Haiti because of the medical work they've done in Haiti. Um, they have the most advanced gerontology program in the Americas. The first person of African descent to go to space is a Cosmos astronaut out of Cuba. So, in every layer of life, they have demonstrated to you the way we celebrate Langston Hughes here in the Harlem Renaissance. They have a African there named Nicholas Guillen, if you look at their history, who was the poet of their revolution, who was an African. They even called him the Langston Hughes of Cuba. And you mentioned the Panthers. A staple of Black Panther culture is Cuban solidarity. Assata Shakur is safe and sound in Cuba because of that relationship. For those of you who know the history of Angela Davis, she finished her autobiography in Cuba, which is just as important as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. finishing Where Do We Go From Here in Jamaica. So this shows the ability to expand outside of the United States political context and the mainstream political context. Huey P. Newton went to Cuba. Eldridge Cleaver went to Cuba. So anyone who's a Panther that or says that they want to reignite the tradition of the Panther, they would become part and parcel of this fight to lift the blockade on Cuba. And blockades represent diplomatic terrorism. And the reason that the blockade was imposed was to stifle their economy and exhaust their ability to flourish in social infrastructure. So, to bring the educational system crumbling to its knees, to bring the healthcare system crumbling to its knees, to bring the agriculture system crumbling to its knees. And it is the same type of sanctioning that left 500,000 children in Iraq dead after the first invasion of Iraq. It's the same type of sanctioning that has compromised Zimbabwe, that compromised Eritrea for 10 years, that is compromising Venezuela today. And to quote former President Obama during his first administration, he said, and during his inauguration, he said the might of our military must be matched by the strength of our diplomacy. To translate that, that means that even though bombing countries for the United States government is just as common for them as cross burning is for the Ku Klux Klan, and that is our preference. We like to leave leaders who we can intimidate in a pool of their own blood. But if we cannot do that, what we would rather do is stifle the people and make them submit and capitulate to what we feel is best for them. So that's what the blockade represents.
Dive in, Robbie. This your lane.
No, no, no. I'm just very, again, I'm very grateful for the specifics because really, Tamara, what you were trying to do in Georgia was bring some type of stability and be kind of a leader and a pilot for reparations. And what this gentleman just describes on the huge global level, which people don't really think about it in that context, is the classic MO of colonization and the divestment and starving of communities and or countries, whether they're on an island or not, to make people vulnerable, whether it's a country or a community, and then seize those assets.
And in the go ahead, I'm sorry, Robbie.
No, and it's
But
just
in the,
that a lot of people, when they say make America great, they're thinking of the US alone. And so if we could expand and understand that this is a global discussion, with and think about countries like people or regions, we would be able to surpass the differences that we have to actually create that alliance that's needed for meaningful change instead of fighting amongst each other.
and actually, that work has been done for so long. It just sounds like the people you're talking about, they've never been part of it. So they're not qualified to comment on something that they've never been a part of. So when you speak about it, but back to
Mr.
what she
Obi,
was,
Mr.
yes,
Obi, center yourself so that everybody can see you. Yeah. There you go. There
okay,
you go.
all right.
He's having some technical difficulties over there. I just don't
No,
want anybody to miss a word because I think they're looking at your mouth and your
yeah, I'm
live
trying to,
cam. Yeah,
yeah,
just
I'm trying to center myself. Let me see. Okay, how about now?
that's fine. There you go.
Okay. So the other thing is now let's go back to we talked about the 1960s, so let's come up. So let's take a look at 1983. The Reagan administration starts an organization called the Cuban America National Foundation. And the first leader of it was a gentleman named Jose Mascanosa. And their slogan was, "We're going from being proletarians to profitarians." And the objective of this was to deal with the Cold War. Now, 1983 is the same year that the Reagan administration invades Grenada and assassinates Maurice Bishop on October 19th, 1983. What Maurice Bishop did in Grenada was the most important thing in the Caribbean since what our ancestors did in Haiti on January 1st, 1804 with the Haitian Revolution and what was done in Cuba on January 1st, 1959. And the other thing that the Kennedy administration said when they imposed the blockade is they said that Cuba is not a threat because of its ability to maintain its direction, but the inspiration that it gives others to dare to explore the same course. So when Allende in Chile and his people wanted a socialist revolution, they moved in to crush them. And when Maurice Bishop in this island in Grenada wanted to do the same thing, the Reagan administration said that Grenada's new airport that they were building was going to be a satellite for Cuban missiles and Soviet missiles to be planted. So, under that pretense, they invaded Grenada and snatched Maurice Bishop's life away. And he was 39, the same age that Dr. King and Malcolm X were when the FBI and CIA did away with them. So this is one of the things. And then, so that same year, this organization is established. On a cultural level, I grew up in this country. I grew up in Washington, D.C. during what's called the crack era and the PCP era. And we know on a cultural level, popular culture, one of the most utilized instruments of that time was the movie Scarface, which came out in 1984. For people who study mafia history, they know that Scarface was Al Capone's nickname. And when the movie was first done in 1932, the movie was done by Howard Hughes, the billionaire, to show Al Capone's lifestyle. So one must ask the question, how does a movie made 52 years later but the geographical scene switches from Chicago to Miami. And now you're focusing on a fictional character named Tony Montana. If you look at the beginning of the movie, you've seen Comandante Fidel Castro's speech about the Mariel boat lift. And these were people who were part of the criminal, blue collar criminal element in Cuba before the revolution. Before that revolution, Lucky Luciano, one of the most decorated mafia figures of all time, had a heroin operation from Sicily to Havana, where he used a doll factory to get heroin into Havana and into New York City. His partner Meyer Lansky had a gambling empire in Cuba. This was before the revolution. And after the revolution, every whorehouse and every drug spot was turned into a school or turned into a hospital. But so for people who would not adapt to the spirit of that revolution, they were finally given the opportunity to exit. And they came to Miami. So the purpose of that movie was to show that. So that movie, even though it ended up enticing many of our young brothers to get involved in the distribution of crack cocaine. The original intent of that movie was to demonize the Cuban Revolution. A couple of years before that, for some of your viewers who are boxing fans, there was a fight in Miami between Aaron Pryor and Alexis Arguello. Alexis Arguello was a Nicaraguan who was attempting to capture his fourth boxing championship in four different divisions. He started off as a featherweight, then he was a junior lightweight, then he was a lightweight. He was trying to become a junior welterweight, and he fought Aaron Pryor, one of the best fighters in the world at the time. And the anti-Cuban, the anti-Castro contingent, the Cuban American National Foundation, they promoted that fight because Alexis Arguello was Nicaraguan. And at the beginning of his career, he was a supporter of the Sandinista Revolution, which was a revolution in Nicaragua that rose up against the Somoza family, which was backed by the United States of America. One family controlled the politics of Nicaragua for 70 years. And when that family was overthrown by the people in the popular revolution, they modeled their revolution after Cuba. So the Cubans in Miami who were against revolution, against socialism, they figured that they could use that fight as a popular cultural instrument to demonize the revolution. And even before that, Godfather 2, for those of you who watched it, the fictional character Hyman Roth, that's really Meyer Lansky. And if you remember, they're celebrating Cuba in New Year's when the revolution triumphs, and Michael Corleone flies out of Cuba to get out of there. So from the very beginning, they have been using film to demonize Cuba. They've been using the classroom to demonize Cuba. They've been using the media to demonize Cuba. They've been using entertainers like Gloria Estefan and Andy Garcia and Celia Cruz and so many to attack their revolution. But African people, we have been their best friend. Joe Louis took a delegation of journalists to Cuba in 1959. Amiri Baraka took John Henry Clark and Julian Mayfield and Harold Cruz in 1960. They met with Malcolm in Harlem. And when they welcomed Comandante Fidel Castro and his delegation to the Hotel Teresa, our hood hotel at the time, because no other hotel in New York, the Kennedy administration put the word out that no hotel should allow them to stay there. They threatened to camp out in Central Park as an act of protest, but they ended up in Harlem with us. And there was only one person that was against them coming to Harlem. He had a one-man demonstration, sort of like James Meredith's demonstration in Mississippi, none other than Jackie Robinson, who, even though he was a great athlete, off the baseball field, he always struck out politically. He struck out politically when he attacked Paul Robeson, when he came before the House of Un-American Activities Committee and attacked Paul Robeson. He struck out when he was the first person in our community to condemn Muhammad Ali for refusing to go to Vietnam. And anytime they would try to get someone to debate Brother Malcolm, they could depend on Jackie Robinson, and they'd take him off the leash and try to sick him on Malcolm, even though he was no match for Malcolm in terms of exchanging ideas. So that for many years they've done this, and all it's done is make Cuba more attractive to us. Going up to 20 years ago, many of your viewers may remember the Elian Gonzalez situation, where the Miami Mafia, as the Cubans called them, they kidnapped a child to make a 7-year-old to make a point politically. And all that happened is Comandante Fidel Castro said, thanks to you, your average citizens have learned more in 4 months about Cuba than they have in 41 years. And this past year, since the corona pandemic has taken place, more people have learned about the Cuban healthcare system in the last year than they did in the last 20 or the last 30 or the last 40. However, last year marked the 20th anniversary when a pact was signed between the Congressional Black Caucus and the Cubans that 500, they would like to give 500 medical scholarships away to young people in this country, primarily people of African descent, then people of Native American and Latino descent, and even poor Caucasians, poor white trash, as some people call them. And they could come to the Latin American School of Medical Sciences for 6 years, take a scholarship worth $250,000, and come back to the poorest parts of this country and practice their trade. For our people, that was lightning in a bottle, or a manna from the heavens, if you will, because of the fact that Booker T. Washington, before he left us, started Negro Health Month. His biggest opponent, Du Bois, they agreed on the healthcare question. Du Bois did a sociological study in 1905 called The Physique and Health of the Negro American. And then we formed the National Medical Association in 1896 because we were only 33 years removed from Abraham Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation. So they weren't going to let us in no American Medical Association. So as an act of self-determination, we started our own organization. So we've been fighting for quality health care all this time. So the Cubans looked at the situation and said, you know what? They talked to Congressman Benny Thompson in Mississippi. And when he gave them the stats of health doctor to patient ratio in Mississippi, Comandante Fidel said, wow, that's as bad as it was before our revolution. I'll tell you what, I'll offer y'all 500 scholarships a year. And even though, in spite of the propaganda, in spite of the malicious nature of the Democrats and Republicans, 200 students have graduated from that program in 20 years, but the original goal is to send 500 students a year down there. So we should not give up on that goal. And the objective of it is for people to come back to Southeast DC, South Bronx, New York, South Central Los Angeles, Southeast San Diego, the poorest and most challenged and compromised areas of the country where healthcare is a dream and a fantasy for people, and make it real for them. So these are the type of things when we have this exchange, we're always looking to promote. Cuba's always looking for a way to bridge these things. And the last thing that made people feel a little positive was a few years ago when President Obama took his high profile field trip down there, which was a significant step, because if you remember his campaigning in 2006, when he spoke to those terrorists in Miami, he appeased them and he said, Cuba's never known human rights. Cuba's never known justice, the usual spiel, the usual nonsense. But when he went there, um, he was told by Comandante Raul Castro, we want reparations for the blockade. That's what he was told. And then not only that, he said the blockade should be loosened. To all our ancestors who were lynched, what difference would it make if you loosened the noose but still kept them on the tree? To all of our babies that are handcuffed by terrorist police every day, what difference if it makes if they loosen up the handcuffs a little bit? You're still going to go to jail. They might take you in a corner and end your life. So these liberal overtures, these opportunist overtures by mainstream politicians, what people need to understand is that blockade will only be lifted when we fight. We're ready for the fight. Africans are patient. We're resilient. We were colonized in in Zimbabwe in 1890, and we gained our independence in 1980. We fought every day. We were colonized in Guinea in 1890, liberated in 1958. We were colonized in Angola in 1575 and liberated in 1975. Our ancestors came to Jamestown in 1619, and only till in 1863 till the chains come off. And then after the chains came off, we had to fight another 103 years to deal with another phase of dehumanization, and we're still fighting right now. So we understand how long that fight is going to take. But all we want to do is just continue to put these things in context and encourage people to do the work that's necessary. And this is for people who want to execute ideas that they articulate. If you're strictly an articulator, if you're strictly a commentator, if you're strictly a pontificator, this isn't for you. This is only for the fighter. This is only for the servant. This is only for the frontliner. That's one of the other problems, Robbie. You have people who are commentators, and for some reason, people mistaken them for fighters. They're victims of mistaken identity. Somebody who just stays on Twitter all day long should never be mistaken for Dr. King, never be mistaken for Malcolm X, never be mistaken for Ida B. Wells, never be mistaken for Dorothy Height, never be mistaken for Septima Clark. All you represent is a glorified mockery. And if you have the wrong context on top of that, if you're spewing confusion on top of that, all we understand that that's nothing more than the struggle to treat social science with the same courtesy you treat math and natural science. You don't get to say 2 plus 2 is 97 because you feel like it. If it doesn't make sense, keep it to yourself. You can't go in the science lab and say that dust and sweat equals chlorophyll. They'll throw you out of there because you may blow the lab up. So only when it comes to history, only when it comes to politics, can people say anything they want because they feel like it without having to verify whether it's even the truth. And we've been lied to too much as a people. So we don't compromise when it comes to entertaining lies. We want to bury the lies until we're organized enough to bury the liar.
Woo!
That's a punch.
That was a punch, Robbie. A 1-2 punch, right?
Well, I'm so glad he brought up the media and the movies because it's no different than King Kong or Birth of a Nation or the Rocky movies and the indoctrination of America and or of people in America to believe that this is the only way. And he's it's an excellent point that Cuba remains functioning, still being under attack, but actually exporting. They actually produce, unlike other.
Thank you for bringing that up, Robbie. Right now, they are the only vaccine manufacturer in Latin America. Last year, for the corona pandemic, they recommended interferon alpha 2B, which they made in 1986 in their Center for Genetic and Biotechnical Engineering. And it was for people with HIV/AIDS. But because of the compatibility in symptoms, 45 nations requested for it. But guess what they've done since then? They've created 4 corona vaccinations, one called Sovereign 1, one called Sovereign 2, one called Mambisa, dedicated to the highest ranked woman guerrilla fighter during the Spanish American War, and another one called Abdallah after a Jose Marti poem. The one Sovereign 2, their corona rate is so low they can't even do clinical testing in Cuba. They had to give it into Iran. But this is the thing, because of the blockade, they can't even mass produce it. They say Cuba is covered. We want to offer it to the rest of the world. And I've been part of a campaign since last year called the Get Out of Cuba Way movement. We'll send you all the information. We're fighting for Cuban medical personnel, the Henry Reeve Medical Brigade, which is named after a Brooklyn, New Yorker, a white man, who went to Cuba and fought on the side of the Cubans during the Spanish American War. And he and the brigade is named after him. They go all over the world and help people. They are responsible for a project called Operation Project Miracle in conjunction with Venezuela that has restored eyesight to thousands of people on the verge of going blind. They You saw what they did in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia 5 years ago during the Ebola pandemic. They sent 400 doctors there to deal with that. But they're in Italy right now, 54 of them. They're all over the world dealing with the corona pandemic. And the only country who won't let them in is the United States of America, which is consistent because 16 years ago, Comandante Fidel Castro called up the State Department and said, I got 500 doctors for you who are ready to come and deal with Hurricane Katrina because we have a specialized group of people who deal with environmental disasters. The United States ignored them. He called back the next day. They said, what the hell do you want? He said, no, 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 I made a mistake. They were like, oh, you don't want us, you didn't want to come. He said, no, I told you 500. It's actually 1,500. After the 500, after the other doctors heard, 1,000 came and said, Fidel, we're ready to come. And they're ready to come to a country that has tried to assassinate their leader 635 times. You think about that. Ready to come to a country that's blockaded them. And what's so interesting about that, Sister Tamara and Sister Robbie, the United States government accuses Cuba of trying to politicize healthcare. That suggests that they only go to countries who are compatible with them in thinking. The example they use to counter that is about nearly 20 years ago. The First Lady of Honduras at the time was in Cuba signing a memorandum of understanding for 700 doctors to be deployed to Honduras. At the same time that was going on, her husband was in Geneva with the Bush administration, pushing through a resolution accusing them of human rights violations. And they did not, because of that, pull their doctors back. They said that's all the more reason to send them. Because when their doctors are there treating patients who are subjected to the propaganda of BBC, who are subjected to the propaganda of Voice of America, who are subjected to the propaganda of the New York Times, those doctors get to tell those patients the truth because they always target everyday people. And so it's nothing that anybody can say anymore. And they have won the war of ideas. At this particular point, it just requires that all of us, regardless of where we stand on the spectrum, and Sister Tamara, this will bring a smile to your face. When we created this appeal, you know, it was the first organization to sign it? The National Council of Churches, the most powerful religious body in this country, who have been supporting the Cubans for a very long time. As a matter of fact, when she was the Secretary General, Reverend Joan Campbell, Dr. Joan Brown Campbell, who I'm proud to call a friend, who is in the tradition of Dorothy Day, who is in the tradition of Mother Teresa, she helped negotiate Elian Gonzalez's return to Cuba. And the National Council of Churches and the Cuban Council of Churches had intense correspondence about making creating a passageway for the brigade to come here to deal with the corona question. So, at all levels of dialogue, at all levels of exchanges, this should happen. As a matter of fact, Raz Baraka, the son of Amiri Baraka, the mayor of Newark, he has promised me that he's going to write a letter to the African American Mayoral Association so that all 700 of our mayors, or how many we got more than we've ever had, we know that they should sign on and push for Cuban medical personnel to come to the country right now. We have a commitment from the state senator out of the 23rd district in Alabama, the poorest district in this country, I believe, or one of them, that she wants the
Obi,
national.
Obi, pull your camera down so we can see. We don't want to miss your mouth. There it is.
Okay.
There you go.
The,
There you go.
the National Conference of Black State Legislators, they're supposed to be coming. We're pushing for them to come on board with this. In San Francisco, the Board of Supervisors, which is equivalent to Council Women and Men and all the women and men, they've signed on in support of this. So some of those elected officials that you're trying to target, Sister Tamara, they're on board, but we need a push. Out of Georgia, out of Atlanta, they should have a push. But before we do that, you're so right for having me come on and begin the way I did. We have to give them the history. We have to give them the context. Because unfortunately, Sister Robbie, people who call themselves activists today, they're historically dismissive and they act like because they're willing to go out and protest, they're exempt from study. And then they repeat the same mistakes from 40 years ago, 50 years ago, with dire consequences. And they make the worst one of all, which is that they don't even realize that every move they make, the fundamental question you answer before you march your first step, before you organize your first demonstration, is you have to say, are our people going to benefit from this, or is the enemy going to benefit from this? Joe Biden benefited more from the death of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor than we did. The same way when we were in our early 20s and we shut this country down over Rodney King, as Jane Fonda put it, we were full of hate and rage. Who is she to take my temperature? She is an African. But anyway, um, they said Bill Clinton was the beneficiary. When we shut down this country for one day during the Million Man March, and 4 million young people did not go to work and school, and 2 million people came to DC, Clinton steps in front 4 days before and says, I endorse the message and not the messenger. And that helped him get reelected. So, whatever we do on a local level, whatever we do on a national level, whatever we do on a global level, we have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, let us be the beneficiary of our resistance, not those we're waging resistance against.
Robbie.
I mean, it's hard. It's there's nothing to challenge. He's completely accurate, and it's a lot of people, I guess, who are on Twitter, or in fact, there was a or who are what they call armchair activists, or whatever you want to call it, social media, reaping benefits. I mean, I'm not saying that this is the case, but there's a huge argument for people like Sean King, and these platforms, these huge, I mean, literally just massive platforms. And again, who's benefiting, right? Benefiting off of what? But I'm glad you tied it to politicians, because Tamara literally spent a year of her life, and we supported her going around discussing, what really is the difference between our two parties that we have the option to choose. And this is where media is so important, because their comments right here with us today that they've never heard, people have never heard anything that you're talking about, right?
You're exactly right. And right now, next door to you in Selma, Alabama, they're doing the Jubilee again. And I go down there every year, and I usually work in the schools. But when I'm down there, you could bump into Al Sharpton, you could bump into Willie Barber, you could bump into Jesse Jackson, and we tell them all the same thing. You better hope our people don't do voter education, because if we do voter education, the first thing we have to do is look at our historical relationship to both parties. How are things going to look then? Because and look, and we always have to tell people this, if we have an exchange, if you say that voting is the most effective outlet of political expression for African people, we can intelligently and maturely discuss that, not even debate it, because that has antagonistic overtones. We could talk like we're talking now. But if you say it's the only outlet of expression, that's a spit in the face. And actually it defeats your argument, because when we got off the plantations thanks to rebellions and the Underground Railroad. No vote there. What it did is it forced Reconstruction to come in. Um, we During the Vietnam War, we were 33% of the front line, but 18% of the country's population. They assassinate Sammy Young Jr. in Tuskegee. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee comes out against the draft, against Vietnam. We smashed the draft. The right to vote itself is the reinstituting of the right to vote, because all we got in 1965 from Johnson is what we already had 99 years before. So from that vantage point, that's the work of SNCC, that's the work of CORE, that's the work of SCLC, that's the work of the NAACP. So when you look at the work we've done in the field of education, the work we've done in healthcare, it is grassroots organizations that have always carried the done the heavy lifting for African people. And the only problem we have is with the narrative that says that voting is an obligation, but organizing is an option. That is a spit in the face of every warrior to put their life on the line for us. And since this is Women's Month, we're dedicating this whole month to an organization called the National Association of Colored Women Clubs. Why? Because y'all are women, so just imagine this. Imagine Ida B. Wells, Margaret Murray Washington, the wife of Booker T. Washington, Nannie Helen Burroughs, Mary Church Terrell, Harriet Tubman, and in the same organization. Well, they were. It was called the National Association of Colored Women. And a woman not as well known as them, named Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, brought them together. And she started the first all African women's newspaper in this country called the Women's Era. So, it's just a thing. So in the spirit of organizing, this is the type of political education you get. And as one of the key people who taught me, Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, who trained me right there with Mukasa Dada, who's in Atlanta with you. We're going to introduce him to you, Sister Tamara. They say political education must flow as rapidly through our community as blood flows through our veins. But the only thing is, once we've given people the information, we have to have action that matches it. We have to have projects, campaigns, and initiatives that demonstrate that we put the time in, and that we are willing to follow up on any demonstration we have, any rally we have, any symposium we have, any conference we have. Because if we don't follow up, matter of fact, you look at what media does. Media will, if you're like last week, we had a concert with artists from all over the world that wanted to salute Cuba for their fight dealing with this corona pandemic. And we got all these interviews from independent media and underground media, but they wanted to talk to us before the event. You're our first interview after the event. So media propagates the notion that follow up isn't even a prerequisite for waging resistance in the first place. So there's a level of maturity that needs to be the maturity gap needs to be raised, the maturity bar needs to be raised. The balance between theory and practice, that's a harmonious thing. And as Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah taught us 60 years ago, practice without thought is blind, thought without action is empty. Our resistance must have direction. So all we're trying to do is just do what we need to do. And right now, Cuba is the push. And we're doing this in closing in the context of the historical moment. Cuba is doing this at a moment where the gap between the wealthy and the poor is wider than it's been in the history of human existence. According to Forbes magazine, the Bible of imperialism, the Bible of rape, the Bible of plunder, there are 2,063 billionaires on the planet worth $9 trillion. At the same time, there are 784 million people on Earth living on $1.90 a day or less. People that if they went to the laundromat could wash their clothes but can't dry their clothes. People if they got on the subway could get on but can't get off unless they jump over the rail and the police may gun them down. So that's the world we live in. Of the 25 poorest nations in the world, 22 are in Africa, Mother Africa. The other three are Haiti, the Solomon Islands, and Afghanistan. So, and on a health and in the context of health, this is the era of non-communicable diseases. For people who don't know what that is, that's strokes, that's heart attacks, that's diabetes, high blood pressure. 11 years ago, the World Health Organization met with the African continent, and they said that they were anticipating from 2011 to 2038, 57 million deaths on the planet from NCDs. So NCDs have surpassed HIV, AIDS, malaria, and cholera as the number one killer. So that the other phase of our project that we're doing is we're calling for our people in this country and our people throughout the diaspora to create a resource pool to provide technical and material support for Cuba's medical work on the African continent. They have 4,000 doctors dispersed throughout Africa. So while we're fighting for them to come to the United States, we're fighting to empower them to continue to do what they're doing in Africa, which is unrealistic to expect them to do things the way they have because that blockade is so crippling. That blockade compromises them. So while we marvel at their accomplishments, we have to say, without the blockade, imagine what they could do. So this is why we're so happy that we were able to come on today. As Tamara gave me a mandate, deal with the history first. And what we'll make sure is that we will do what's necessary to make sure that people understand why this is so important. And like we said, I mean, when you deal with Cuba, now we talked about Cuba and Africa, what you talking about? I'm the U.S. correspondent to Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe has a 97% literacy rate. Guess why? Because between 1986 and 1996, Cuba took 3,000 Zimbabwean teachers, trained them in a place called the Island of Youth, sent them back to Zimbabwe, and they are the backbone of the educational system in Zimbabwe. Um, we mentioned what they did with Ebola in that part. On a military level, they fought with us in Angola, they fought with us in Guinea-Bissau, they fought with us in Mozambique. As a matter of fact, Samora Machel, the president of Mozambique, and for people who look at the amputated narrative of the African experience, let's make a connection for you. Mozambique was the first country in Africa to model its resistance after the Underground Railroad. Because what the Portuguese did is they set up borders that they couldn't, because Tanzania had come out and said they Mozambicans that wanted to fight in an armed struggle against the Portuguese based on their track record of violence, they could come to Tanzania for training. So one of the things the Portuguese did is they set up blocking points so that Mozambicans couldn't escape Mozambique and get to Tanzania for training. So they, Frelimo, the Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, the Revolutionary Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, they studied the Underground Railroad and they established escape routes. And the other parallel is Samora Machel, the first president of Mozambique. His name is Moises, his middle name, which is how you say Moses in Portuguese. And he was a nurse. So his name, he was a nurse like Harriet Tubman, and his name was Moses like Harriet Tubman, and he's a liberator like Harriet Tubman. And we wrote a children's play called Araminta and Samora, liberating the oppressed, treating the sick. And we wrote a play about the Cuban doctors 10 years ago called Cuba's Greatest Army. And we're on the verge of having the first children to children's exchange between our theater company, the Mass Emphasis Children's History and Theater Company, and La Colmanita, which is the National Theater Ensemble in Cuba. So we're not just up here on the lecture tip. And I'm not a professor, by the way. I'm a guerrilla teacher. I'm not a master teacher either. My furthest academic accomplishment is a BA. I don't even have a master's. But in the spirit of Malcolm, the eighth grade dropout, the most honorable Elijah Muhammad, the fifth grade dropout, Patrice Lumumba, the 10th grade dropout, it's our commitment to the people that takes precedence over whatever we're able to accomplish academically. But on the other side of things, we belong to a front line that has produced the likes of Du Bois, the first PhD from Harvard, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the second PhD from Harvard. So we get the best of both worlds on this front line. And the front line is the ultimate equalizer where dropouts and PhDs can fight this vicious enemy of ours together. And there's room for everybody.
Robbie, you see why I invited him. I'm telling you, when I heard him, I was in my car. I was going wherever I was going, and I stopped. I just stopped. I said, I don't know who he is. I don't know how I'm going to find him, but I'm going to find this man, and I want to bring him on our broadcast. You see why?
You spoke a bit about, you covered the revolution, and the reason I'm asking is because prior to the revolution, there was a series of like puppet presidents in Cuba that just really, devastated.
Because of what the Spanish-American War, and they prevailed. So Cuba was just like the Dominican Republic under Trujillo. It was just like Nicaragua under Somoza. It was just like Haiti under Papa Doc and Baby Doc until the revolution came. And then after the revolution came, it has become the benchmark for the Americas. And a lot of the Democrats in our community get angry at us, but we tell them without apology, our favorite American president, when you accept the real definition of America, it's Comandante Fidel Castro. Yes, over Woodrow Wilson, who was a Ku Klux Klan supporter. Yes, over Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a racist. And as a matter of fact, when Du Bois took the United States before the United Nations in 1947, no one did more to stop him than sabotage him than Eleanor Roosevelt. And she was on the board of the NAACP at the same time. Yes, we love Fidel more than we love Clinton, more than we love Carter, and yes, more than Obama too. And if you did a Mount Rushmore of liberals, those are the peoples whose heads would be on the stones. So we're just saying, and for us, we want revolutionary political vehicles as our parties. So that independent party they tried to have in Cuba, the Democratic Party of Guinea, the Convention People's Party of Ghana, the Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, the All African People's Revolutionary Party. These are our models of the type of parties that we want. And one of the things that the imperialists have also done in terms of Africa and the Caribbean, they've told you that multi-party democracy is the best representation of democracy. All they're really saying is that gives an outlet to the parties they want to finance and control to cause disturbance. Because if you have one political party and women call it their party, men call it their party, youth call it their party, Muslims call it their party, Christians call it their party, people who practice traditional spiritual disciplines call it their party. Who are you to say that that's not democratic? How is that not? It represents unity. It represents objectivity. It represents cultural tolerance. But they've been able to use these neo-colonialist governments in Africa and the Caribbean to tell us that that's not the way to go. And that same year in 1983, Reagan did three other things because of this. He created three organizations after speaking to Europe's parliament: the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, and the International Republican Institute. And they go all over the world telling people how to be democratic. And then they have the nerve to come to Africa the way the missionaries told us to go and be better Christians. But the interesting thing is, this country doesn't have the political culture tolerant enough for a woman to win. Ask Hillary Clinton, ask Kamala Harris. But in Malawi, they had a woman president. In Liberia, we had a woman president. In the Central African Republic, we had a woman president. Doesn't Ethiopia have a woman president now? So how can they go to Africa and lecture us on democratic tolerance? And we've had more women presidents and women prime ministers than they've ever even entertained the thought of having. So it's just important for us to just know the current developments in the world and to be able to contextualize those current developments historically. So when the Democrats and Republicans try to come and clip our wings, we soar over them and keep moving forward.
I knew 1 hour would not be enough time for this man.
Yeah,
I
we're
knew
done
it.
today, but we'll come back anytime.
We are
Anytime.
going to have you come back, Mr. Obi, because I
Yes,
knew
ma'am.
it wouldn't be. I knew it wouldn't be. I want to thank you for
And
joining us.
I hope we met your expectations.
Absolutely, and then some.
Okay.
Absolutely, and then
Because
some. Rob,
you were on me because you were talking about the Georgians, and I told you shout out to all our sisters and brothers in Atlanta that hear us on WRFG and have heard us the last few years on the Friday night drum. Much love to Kweku Lumumba. Much love to Tutmo Sankara, and of course, much love to the Dada family. Mukasa Dada, the SNCC alum, his wonderful wife Maimuna Dada, and his son Abeku Dada, who is a graduate of the Latin American School of Medical Sciences and was one of the young leaders of the Corona response team at Grady Memorial right there in Atlanta, thanks to his training in Cuba.
they want to know how they can follow you. I asked you if you had a website. He's on social
Um,
media, guys. I
yeah,
found him on Facebook.
yeah, I'm on Facebook, Obi Egbuna. There are a few other people with that name, but you can recognize me if you saw me today. None
Mhm.
of them are as handsome as me. I'm just playing. I'm joking. I'm at Junior Egbuna. That's the Twitter. My email address is OBIEGBUNA. Let me put it in the chat. Let me put that in it.
It's your full name. Your name is on the
Yeah,
screen. So it's your full
exactly.
name,
Obiekbuna15 at gmail.com.
15.
Yes, ma'am. And Junior Egbuna is the Twitter. So this is how people can keep in touch.
Yeah.
And like I said, we just want to, and let's find an elected official down there, Sister Tamara, local or whatever, councilwoman, councilman, who's gutsy enough to make the demand for Cuban medical personnel to come to Atlanta. I think we could find one.
I think we can too. I think we can too. We're definitely gonna talk further, but I want to thank you for joining us. We're at the top of the hour, Miss Robbie. I knew this conversation would be just what it was. It was rich. I knew it. My biggest takeaway is he said you better hope we don't do voter education. And you know that's my lane, right?
I knew you'd
Empowering
like
our
that.
people.
That was just for you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Y'all have to take that, cut that clip out and pass that around because that's
Thank you.
powerful. But I want to
Okay.
thank you, Mr. Obi. We are definitely going to have you back on. Thank you for joining us on this broadcast. You can find Miss Robbie Caban, the beautiful Miss Robbie Caban, at robbiecaban.com.
Yeah.
You can find me, Tamara Johnson Shealey, at tamarashealey.com. Of course, you can find Mr. David. He playing hooky today on Facebook right here at Acknowledge the Divide. And every week we give voice to issues, activists, and activism. Our Cash App is TamaraForGeorgia.com. We're growing this broadcast. We have some big plans, y'all, for 2021. Robbie, I'll see you in just a little while. This was rich, just as I thought it would be.
Great info.
Great. It was nothing we could say. Just sit and listen and learn, right?
Yeah. There's a reason that Cuba's not being covered and so on. And we're afraid of it as a country. We're afraid of what they've done. And we need to open up different viewpoints and see things on a global scale. And that's exactly what he did. It's perfect.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Great broadcast. I see you at 12:30. We got a meeting. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you. Keeping Up with Congress is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, y'all. See you on Monday.